Tony, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We'd like to start with just some opening comments on the history of the Bill of Rights, and then we'll go to questions.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction, Kathy, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure I'll be getting a lot of good, tough questions from my young interlocutors, as always. And again, congratulations to Constituting America and just all the great things you're doing for civics education. We certainly have that in common, as I'm a senior fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute. And I'm really excited about this series. What an opportunity to, right after Constitution Day, now build up to the Bill of Rights and study that and examine it with I'm sure gonna have a bunch of episodes with a bunch of different scholars on the topic towards December 15th. And it was my pleasure to write on the Bill of Rights for you frequently. The story of the Bill of Rights is really very interesting historically, how it was created. It really is, I think, as we said early on, a matter of a spirit of compromise, of common purpose, of moderation, of prudence. And James Madison, father of the Constitution, although it was really a collective effort at the convention, really deserves just a tremendous amount of credit. And I'd like to kind of focus in on him during my few remarks before we get some great questions from you in the audience. Madison was a state and national figure, serving in both the state legislature and the National Congress during the Articles of Confederation, but was very concerned about sort of where the country was headed. And he wanted to really empower, really strengthen the national government, and was really in many ways quite concerned about some of the injustices that were going on at the state level. Some of the sort of examples of majority tyranny in Virginia here, certainly the violations of religious liberty, of conscience, of religious dissenters like the Baptists and so forth. Even in the 1770s, sort of as we're preparing to fight the revolution, their rights are being violated. After the war, we see throughout several different states violating the rights of Tories, those who had supported the British, a lot of property violations and violations of their national rights. So Madison's very concerned about that and writes about that in sort of as part of his preparation to the convention in a document called The Vices of the Political System, and really kind of hones in on those injustices that were going on in the states. And he goes to the convention, and there's a lot of give and take, a lot of compromise, a lot of moderation has to be shown. And one of the things Madison really, really wants, he thinks is central to this new constitutional plan that they're putting together, is a national veto. He really wants to kind of control the injustices that were going on in the states. Wants the national government to veto state legislation. He doesn't get that, and yet in the end, he ends up being what is sort of one of the main supporters, one of the main proponents of the Constitution. Of course, as we know, he will, after it's signed, it'll go on to popular ratifying conventions in the states. Madison, of course, is one of the leading figures, leading Federalists in support of the Constitution in Virginia. But there's this whole ratification debate that shapes up. And during that debate, a lot of anti-federalists hammer away the fact that there was not a Bill of Rights included in the Constitution. And George Mason from Virginia had actually proposed one, right, sort of at the end of the convention, but it was unanimously defeated, which is very interesting, right? I think the delegates were just kind of tired, and they had debated and deliberated and hammered away at a compromise, and eventually, got to the mid-September and really in many ways wanted to go home, didn't want to sort of thrash out a Bill of Rights. But there were some, like James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Alexander Hamilton of New York, and James Madison, who are actually opposed to a Bill of Rights. And I think their arguments are really kind of interesting and in many ways brilliant. And I really recommend everyone go read Federalist 84, which is Hamilton's argument against a Bill of Rights. It's really a brilliant kind of examination of self-government broadly, not just whether we should have a Bill of Rights. So whether you agree with him or not, it's a very, very interesting argument. And basically what they say is that, the Constitution itself is a Bill of Rights. So, and the national government has certain powers. The Congress had enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. And we have a limited government. So the government, by definition, is not allowed to violate individual rights. Some other arguments they make are very interesting. They say that, Madison especially has some correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, and he says, look, this is just a parchment barrier. We have state bills of rights, they're being violated. Just having a piece of paper is not going to stop sort of ambitious and passionate majorities from violating the rights of minorities, okay? And they also say a couple more things. One is, if you write some down, you're going to leave some rights out. Does that mean government can violate those rights? We certainly hope not. But that's the great danger, of course, that you're going to leave certain rights out. And Hamilton makes the argument in Federalist 84 that if you write them down, they're going to be ambiguous. You're going to leave wiggle room to violate rights where there was no room before. And of course, we all know in the Bill of Rights, there's nothing ambiguous about them. We don't debate their meaning. Or, of course, I'm being sarcastic. We do all the time, and we have for 235 years. So those are the arguments against it. But the anti-federalists are hammering away. The Constitution gets ratified by 5 states and then just kind of stalls. There's a huge debate, a very narrow, very close debate in Massachusetts. And many are concerned, many Federalists are concerned they're not going to ratify. So they actually concede a promise that they'll grant a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. But it's recommended. It's not conditional on ratification, which is a very important distinction. So not conditional, but a promise, a recommended amendments. And this is followed in some other states as well. Madison is apoplectic. He very much opposes this because he's very concerned that these amendments will not only include some individual liberties that are protected, which of course he supports, but Patrick Henry and others, other anti-federalists, want a second convention. They want to propose amendments that change the actual structure and powers and limit the government and sort of change the constitutional order, change the system that was created in Philadelphia. And Madison is very opposed to this. So he actually thinks, sort of the whole debate is ruined at this point, but he goes on, right? He sort of lost the national veto at the convention, lost this again, but still compromises, is moderate, and continues to argue for the Constitution. It's ratified very narrowly in Virginia in June of 1788. Eventually, New York ratifies as well, and it becomes the law of the land. North Carolina, Rhode Island do not ratify, in part because of an absence of a Bill of Rights. So the Constitution becomes the law of the land. Fast forward a little bit to early 1789. We're setting up the new government. The first Congress meets. George Washington is inaugurated. James Madison actually helps to compose that inauguration speech. And it's in favor of a Bill of Rights. Okay, so Washington, through Madison, endorses the Bill of Rights to the American people to ratify. And the first Congress gets started, and it goes on to a lot of important business, right? The cabinet, all the departments are being set up. Madison and others are taking the lead in establishing a national revenue and tariffs and so forth. the issue of slavery comes up, and many different issues. Hamilton introduces his financial plans and so forth. So there's a lot of important business going on. And Madison remembers that promise to get a Bill of Rights. In fact, he made that promise running for Congress. He was in a very tight race with James Monroe for a House seat. He was sort of shut out of the Senate by Patrick Henry and his allies. So he runs for a House seat against Monroe. And it's very narrow. And he actually, even though he's against the Bill of Rights, he kind of comes around through some correspondence with Jefferson, who's off in Paris during the convention and during the ratification debate. Jefferson supports the Bill of Rights and persuades Madison it might be a good idea. The other thing is, Madison makes that promise in that campaign for the House seat, especially because the Baptists and a Reverend John Leland sort of, ask him to protect religious liberty for dissenters and so forth. And Madison makes that promise. And so for him, it's a sacred obligation to move forward to follow through with what was promised in the ratifying conventions and his own promise. So he starts assembling amendments from all the conventions, comes up with a list of about 200, starts whittling them down, gets rid of all the structural amendments that would change the Constitution, focuses in on the individual liberties, and has this great speech on June 8th. It's readily available online at the BillOfRightsInstitute.org or teachingamericanhistory.org. Great primary source, great speech to read, won't take you that long. So this June 8th speech by Madison, he comes out in favor of a Bill of Rights. And he does so for several reasons, but he says, look, the arguments he makes in the speech, this is a spirit of amity, of friendship, of common good. We want to satisfy the opponents of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists. We made a sacred promise to them. We need to follow through on that. We want to encourage popular attachment of the American people to this new system of government, to this new Constitution. The way to do it is by protecting their individual liberties. And he says right in the speech, he uses words like amity, friendship, moderation, prudence, right? He thinks this is just a good idea. And he also says, interestingly, like this probably won't do any harm. He sort of acknowledges his former resistance to it, but it'll probably do some good. Protecting liberties is always a good thing. So it's very interesting, the reaction though. Many people in Congress didn't want to bother. A lot of the Federalists said, well, we already ratified the Constitution. Let's just move on. They're getting to other business, which is all really important. I already mentioned several examples. One congressman says, it's a tub to the whale. It's a distraction. They used to send out, while they were hunting whales, they would send out a small boat or a tub to distract the whale, to make it easier to hunt. And so they sort of used a cinching metaphor that everyone at the time would have understood. They say it's just a mere tub to the whale. And Madison says, no, this is not just a distraction. This is a sacred obligation. So he moves forward. He sort of urges Congress to take action. And eventually they do. There's a committee appointed. Eventually the House will pass 17 of the amendments that Madison had from his list. The Senate eventually passes 12. They reconcile and pass that final 12 by a 2/3 majority in both houses, which is the constitutional standard, of course. President Washington has no say in it, as presidents do not in amendments, but he endorses it, and it's sent to the states. So some final very interesting things about it. Madison wanted the Bill of Rights to be included with the sort of scatter it throughout the text, weave it into the text of the Constitution. Again, he loses that. Also very important, coming back to my original statement about limiting the states and majority tyranny and the injustices in the states, Madison was actually less worried than other people about federal tyranny He was primarily worried about what was going on in the states. And he wanted it to apply to the states. He wanted specific limitations on the states. He doesn't get that. The representatives of the states are just too powerful, and they get rid of that. So Madison doesn't get what he wants, but still, again, throughout this whole process over 2 or 3 years of establishing the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the government, Madison is willing to compromise, show moderation, show friendship, amity, and wouldn't that be a great lesson for all of us today? Is really the point. And eventually, of course, as we know, the Bill of Rights is sent to the states. It's ratified. North Carolina, Rhode Island join the Union and ratify, and it becomes sort of ensconced in our constitutional order. Something very interesting, it was not applied to the states early on, right? And there's a Supreme Court case, Barron versus Baltimore, in which John Marshall emphasized that this is a limit on the national government only, not the states. Of course, the 14th Amendment and a principle called incorporation or substantive due process then applies the Bill of Rights to the states. And so we got a lot of our modern cases and jurisprudence surrounding the Bill of Rights. Really in the 20th and 21st century, we don't really see that in the 18th and 19th century. So Madison, I think a model for not only brilliant constitutional thinking about our constitutional order, father of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, but also one who shows moderation, prudence, some of those classical virtues in his statesmanship in getting all of this.
Well, thank you, Tony. That was a great summary of the history of the Bill of Rights. And, I was looking at one of your essays, and we put the links to your essays in our Q&A, and we encourage everybody in the audience to look at them. But, you quote Madison a couple of times in your essays. And one quote that I thought was really interesting from Madison is, if we can make the Constitution better in the opinion of those who are opposed to it without weakening its frame or abridging its usefulness, in the judgment of those who are attached to it, we act part of wise and liberal men. And it was just such a great example of compromise, and also a great example of elected officials keeping their promises, which doesn't always happen today either. So some great lessons that we can learn. And we're going to go to Tova for questions. But before I go to Tova, I want to give a quick shout out to the students and schools that are with us online today. We have 27 students at Franklin Elementary, 5th grade, with Mrs. Paula Flynn. So welcome, Mrs. Flynn's class. We have 3 homeschool students with Terry Zalesnak, and we have 96 students from the Hamilton County Virtual School with Tiffany Smith. So welcome to all of our students that are with us here today. Tova, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And once again, hello to all of our students. This is so exciting to have you all with us. Hope you're enjoying the program. This is so awesome. Thank your teachers for plugging you in, and we're all so glad to have you. So yeah, Tony, I just have like a few questions. For one, you were kind of at the beginning talking about how Madison was concerned about injustices going on at the state level, tyranny of the majority, violating the rights of Tories and property violations you mentioned briefly. Could you go a bit more into what these injustices were and why, I guess, the Constitution wasn't enough to prevent those from happening without the Bill of Rights?
Very sure. A great question to start, Tova, as usual. Let's take, for example, Virginia, right? Virginia had an official established church, right? The Anglican Church, and dissenters had to pay taxes. They had to attend a certain number of services, even although they could attend their own services. There were a lot of itinerant preachers who went around and were violently beaten and thrown in jail for preaching without a license and so forth. So there's sort of a long history of we call religious persecution because of the established church. And Madison sort of witnessed this after he returned home from Princeton and was really just sort of outraged that this kind of thing would happen. Now, eventually, he'll become the author of the well, not the author, but he helps Thomas Jefferson, who's the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, push that through the Assembly in Virginia. But that's one example, and it also is rectified sort of on the state level as well. A lot of states had bills of rights, most did, and in opposing a national bill of rights, many of these Federalists who made that argument, they're saying, look, the states have their own bills of rights to protect you from that majority tyranny, from that injustice at the state level, and so thereby, we don't need to pass a national bill of rights. But Madison wasn't really buying that argument, because he had, well, his argument was that yes, the states bills of rights are still not protecting the rights of minorities, and as I say, witness the violation of Tory property, right? In several different states, this is being violated. Alexander Hamilton actually takes up the cases as a lawyer in New York of many Tories who are suing for their property rights because the New York State legislature actually allowed in their laws confiscation of Tory property. I mean, and Hamilton, Madison, and others see these violations of property, of conscience, and a host of other ones as violations not only sort of local rights, states' rights, and that kind of thing, but of their natural rights, right? Sort of their Lockean rights to property, rights to conscience, and so forth. So this is dealing with the very rights embedded in our human nature, right? Those inalienable rights, and again, it was, Madison wanted it to apply to the states, but it didn't. And so even going forward, after the Bill of Rights is ratified, the states themselves are the ones who have their own bills of rights, who are supposed to protect these rights. It wasn't the job of the Bill of Rights to protect rights within a state that were being violated by the state government. So now that's something obviously very different today, right? As we look at jurisprudence, for example, on the First Amendment and sort of the Establishment Clause, Religious Liberty Clause, prayer in schools, that kind of thing, as an obvious example. The Supreme Court is ruling on whether students in a local school district can pray, or in class, or during a football game, or read the Bible, or have a prayer at commencement ceremony. There's all important cases in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And so the Supreme Court started doing that after the 14th Amendment, but not during sort of the first half of the Republic.
Wow, thank you. I think that's also cool, that even after Hamilton literally fought against England in the Revolutionary War, he was willing to then defend Tories and their civil rights. I think that's not anyone would do that, especially when you have friends and comrades that have died against that cause. I think that takes a lot.
Kind of remind you real quick of John Adams, right? And the Boston Massacre trial. He's defending the very soldiers who killed 5 citizens, right? They're both in both of those instances standing up for justice, standing up for rights, standing up for natural rights. So
right. And then so if I'm just a little confused, if there's a state bill of rights and a national bill of rights, which one takes precedence, and were there ever cases where they sort of conflicted with each other?
Right, and so I think I'm not a lawyer, but I think the simple answer would be, it depends what's being done, right, and by which level of government, right? So if the state has an oppressive law, or some state official is violating your rights somehow, that would seem to be covered more under the state Bill of Rights, at least as originally conceived. Whereas, the national government would have, been limited in creating an established national church, for example. So it really depended upon which level. And Madison actually doesn't think that the national government's going to do that very often, right? Which is interesting because we seem to have a different view today, right? We sort of see the national government as sort of this kind of massive leviathan and threatening rights, and we think about state governments doing it less, I think. So I think it's an interesting change in sort of just our understanding of our rights and sort of which level of government is more oppressive and which is kind of closer to the people and more protective of our rights.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And then you mentioned earlier too that Madison wanted like a national veto where the national government could veto state laws. Could you clarify a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so when the states pass unjust laws or they pass laws that, let's say, violate national law. For example, a different example than the Tory property or state establishments, which would fall under what we're talking about. The what was I going to say? A lot of the states were violating the peace treaty of 1783. Okay, they were just kind of doing whatever they wanted, and passing tariffs on each other and so forth, assuming powers that they didn't have, and violating the national peace treaty. And instances like this, the religious violations, the Tory property, are sort of all examples of how Madison thinks that that this injustice is happening at the state level, or just the state governments are just sort of out of control. And so he wants at the Constitutional Convention the national government, whether the courts or sort of a council of revision, to examine state laws that it considers unjust and to invalidate them. It's sort of like a judicial review, in a term that we would understand today, of those state laws. And many of the people, even at the Constitutional Convention, although many were nationalists, some still, a couple of representatives from New York and others still, and many there broadly, wanted to preserve sort of some of the prerogatives and some of the powers of the states, right? They didn't want to just sort of get rid of the states. They wanted to preserve some of that power. And so they resist and eventually vote down Madison's proposal. It kind of hangs on there for a while, for over several weeks. They kind of keep coming back to it, and he loses. And I don't think I went into this, but Madison thinks that one thing destroyed the Constitution. He sort of, there's a quote, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says, well, that's the end of it. It's over, right? If we don't have that, then all the injustice, all the problems of the state governments in the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation are just going to continue. And he saw that as disastrous to the very Constitution that was being written, that was being created in Philadelphia. And eventually he comes around and again supports it. So it's again that spirit of moderation, of prudence, of saying, well, we still got something very good, and we can sort of tweak and compromise what we didn't get.
It's one of the hardest things to admit, that you're wrong, or to change your opinion, in the face of changing facts. So definitely takes a lot, especially for someone so brilliant. And then I was also wondering, you've written personally a lot of books about this topic, about Hamilton, about Madison. So I was wondering if you could talk about like the process of writing a book. And maybe we have some like young aspiring writers in the audience today or something, and maybe how writing about these topics helped you understand them more, and if there's anything surprising you learned in your research.
Sure, yeah, all of the above, Brooke. So writing the book, obviously, you're trying to say something original. You're trying to think of an interesting topic, an important topic that, I know I always approach it sort of with an educational bent of wanting to inform, right? Our popular audience out there, young people, but readers 8 through 80, and try to tell a good story, right? I want to make history interesting, right? We just had the very sad passing of David McCullough, and just to think about his contribution over many, many decades to history and to getting people reading history and interested in history is a great thing. Now, I'm no David McCullough, but I try to write a good story and make history very interesting to people, right? And after all, it's a lot of these stories just kind of tell themselves in a lot of ways. And so, you come up with an idea and then you go off and do research and you're digging around in the primary sources like Madison's June 8th speech, like Federalist 84, like the first inaugural, like Madison and Washington's letters to each other, or Hamilton and Washington, looking at diaries and so forth, newspapers. And so you're examining all these primary sources and amassing a lot of evidence to tell your story. And then it's a matter, I think, I like to outline in a very detailed way. I like to consider myself a logical thinker who likes to put everything in order. Obviously, history, you follow a chronology of events and looking at cause and effect. And that's kind of the drudgery, writing the outline, but I outline extensively. And then it's a matter of, which is the most wonderful part besides the research, is putting pen to paper, as they say, and sitting down at the laptop and seeing how all these facts and all this evidence and all these relationships and just thinking what to include, what not to include, what's relevant, and just, putting together, piecing together like a detective, that great story, and then becoming the storyteller to tell that story. So it's not easy, and then getting published is 10 times as hard, but that's how I've gone about writing my books. So.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I think those are all my questions. So I'll turn over to give Jewel and Jordan a chance. But thank you so much for always being on and contributing.
Thank you for your great questions as always.
Hello, we've covered a whole lot of information so far. It's really a fascinating story. Can we talk even just a little bit more about this difference of the 14th Amendment before and after? Because that is something that even when we learn civics in general, we don't realize that it seems like such a cataclysmic shift. So the Bill of Rights specifically limited what the federal government was to not impede upon its citizens, but it did not protect the citizens of the those rights in the citizens of the United States on a whole from their state governments. So that's correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's so the vision of our government. How do you think the vision of our government as a whole changes then before and after?
Right. Yeah. I think it's a very dramatic change in a lot of ways. And first of all, I mean, the 14th Amendment, it was written kind of vague, which is kind of Hamilton's original problem. But it was really in many ways intended as a very important amendment, obviously, and a great amendment. 13th ended slavery. 14th guarantees those rights to freed people in the states, African Americans. Obviously very, very important because those states, as we know, were violating their rights. There was a lot of violence that was going on during Reconstruction. A lot of black codes were being written, so a lot of violations, right? We can't ignore kind of the significance and importance of the 14th Amendment. But as written, it doesn't really only apply to those African Americans. It's really more broadly and it makes them citizens of the United States. Okay. The 15th Amendment obviously allows African American males to vote. So 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, civil rights or Reconstruction amendments, very, very important. But the 14th Amendment, sort of as written, provides for the protection of what's now called substantive due process, right? And protecting these rights, it protects those due process. And over the course of the early to mid 20th century, a lot, the Supreme Court starts to use that 14th Amendment to go in and limit state and local governments from violating the rights of its citizens. Now, what does that do? It certainly we can talk about some specific areas in a second, but it really empowers the federal judiciary. And something very important to note, right at the end of the 14th Amendment, it says Congress shall enforce the provisions of this amendment, right? We really forgot that. Gordon Lloyd, who was a frequent guest on your show, actually pointed that out to me over a decade ago. And it just sort of blew my mind because, very specifically, it empowers Congress to do so, but increasingly the court has taken that over and become sort of the interpreter of the 14th Amendment and how it applies the Bill of Rights to the states. So you see a whole host of jurisprudence on that, and I think we can see very clear ties to also not only the expansion of the power of the federal judiciary, but the power of the federal government itself, right? And so this is all part and parcel of a large shift during the 20th century to the power of the central government. Some examples, some notable examples of the incorporation of this 14th Amendment to include the states and local governments, and also other rights, right? In substantive due process, the court can say certain rights exist. So, for example, let's take free speech, for example, something we all hold dear, very central to giving consent to our government or not giving it to the government, criticizing our government. There were really no free speech cases, right? Before the 14th Amendment, before the 20th century, right? And then it starts to, then you see more and more cases. For example, Tinker versus Des Moines, right? Protects the rights of students in local school. Protests in the Vietnam War with black armbands. I'm glad that free speech is protected, right? But again, that's a real change that's going on. There's a lot of application to the rights of the accused, the right to an attorney. We have the Miranda rights. All these are cases from the 1960s that are applied through incorporation. We have Roe versus Wade. Right, substantive due process creates this right to privacy in the Bill of Rights, and more recently, obviously with the Dobbs case, we pulled back from that. But again, that application to the states, we've already talked about a lot of the religious liberty and establishment cases in Engel versus Vitale and Lee versus Weissman and a bunch of other cases about football games and commencement ceremonies, Bible reading, prayer in schools, that kind of thing. So in a lot of different areas, we see the great expansion of the federal judiciary's power to decide these cases, and some scholars have labeled it an imperial judiciary. In many ways, we talk about the imperial presidency. Some of you even talked about an imperial Congress. But here we have perhaps some examples of the imperial judiciary, sort of imposing in some ways, you might argue, imposing upon what's going on in local communities within the states. Others, though, would argue that it's protecting rights from an oppressive government. So there's a real debate that shapes up around this, and it's been caught up in a lot of discussions about politics and the culture war and et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes we don't have the moderation and prudence of a Madison when we talk about some of these issues. But as you rightly point out, it's created, massive changes in the 20th and 21st century.
I think that's very interesting that it was written originally as a part of Reconstruction and in order to ensure rights on a certain class, but then has been used amidst many other elements of government being used to achieve certain ends, and whether or not those were, do you think that there's a philosophical dissonance at all between, well, let me go back. So the issue was, of course, that there's a dissonance between the ideals of America and slavery, of course, and the founding fathers saw that and we've talked about that on the show a lot. And eventually it ended with the bloodiest war in American history. And then we got these amendments. And I wonder, is there also a dissonance between the federal government even being able to ensure those rights, not particularly for post-slavery, not in that case, but in particularly the way it is in modern era and the way the founding fathers saw the government working?
Yeah, yes, there's definitely a dissonance between sort of, as we looked at all the history of the creation of the Bill of Rights and how, how it applied to the national government. This is endorsed by the Supreme Court, by John Marshall, and it was understood in those terms by everyone at the time of the entire sort of founding generation and sort of after, right, into the 19th century. It's certainly at odds with the founding. Now, again, we can understand the very good reasons for the 14th Amendment, but at the risk of being redundant, I mean, as we said, judicial power, national and federal power, all greatly increased during the 20th and 21st century. And that can, I think in a lot of ways that should be concerning at the very least. It should be troubling. And again, there's a whole debate about it. And, I think it's a debate we should all engage in, especially after we sort of learn a little bit more about it. Yes, it's a dissonance from the founding, and I guess people on both sides decide whether that's a good thing or not. I tend to think not for some of its effects, but that's not to attack the 14th Amendment, though.
It is a really interesting discussion, and definitely coming out of our discussion about the Bill of Rights. As far as learning goes, it's certainly a different way to see our history, as seeing those Bill of Rights for what they really were, separate from the way we really do learn them, more so as if we were protected in that way from any government at any point in time, as soon as they're passed. Or you want to get to?
Just honestly dumb it down for a sec here, and I'm curious about just the real time frame from Constitution to Bill of Rights. And was the thought of the Bill of Rights always was it in their heads, at the passing of the Constitution? Was it really, we're probably going this route, we're going to start a little early and get this done? And now, I'm sure many knew that was coming if it was, but just wanted to speak about that a little bit to get a little more clarity on the time frame.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. As you say, these are complicated things, right? I mean, studying history of the founding, studying the history of the country, studying constitutional law and jurisprudence. Got a big book of case law from a law school on the shelves there. So there's been a lot of study that's gone on. It is not easy sort of kinds of questions about all these big issues. But they're important issues to learn about. As far as the founding goes, I don't think that it was assumed that there would be a Bill of Rights. I mean, you saw rejected in the actual Constitutional Convention when they could have easily assigned George Mason and a few other delegates to a committee and taken another week or two, and they probably could have hammered out some rights with more debate and deliberation. But it was unanimously rejected, unanimously. I mean, they just didn't want to sort of deal with it. And as I said, with this Federalists and Anti-federalists debate, not only about the Constitution, but whether there should be a Bill of Rights or not, and Madison sort of even seeing as a tragedy that they would promise to do a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. It was not a foregone conclusion, right? Historians talk a lot about contingency and so forth and events, and nothing sort of preordained or nothing is really inevitable. I would argue there was nothing inevitable about the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. The first Congress could very easily have just listened to Madison's great speech and thought it was a tub to the whale, as we mentioned. I love that metaphor, by the way. You got to use it like in your conversation sometime this week. But most didn't even want to deal with it in the first Congress, right? When they could have taken the time to just kind of draw it up. Now, eventually they do, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable that they did. And we could easily foresee there was very strong opposition against taking this up. It's right in the debates of the first Congress, which you can get in several books, and it's on, these debates are online and so forth. They're accessible, and so you can see for yourselves just how much opposition there was to it. So yeah, so no, I would argue that it was not ordained, it was not inevitable, and I could easily, as a historian, and hopefully you can with some of the evidence I pointed out, see that it almost didn't happen. So that would have, you don't want to think too much about counterfactuals, but that would have been very interesting. And whether one would have been created later or so forth, you don't know, but it would be very interesting not to have a Bill of Rights, and how that would have changed sort of who would have been the arbiter of these things. Would the courts naturally have done it sooner? Would state governments sort of be more in our mind about what, as sort of the natural defenders of our rights and our state bills of rights, which still exist today? Would it have been all three branches, which is really the way it should be anyway, in both, all levels of government protecting our rights? Or would we actually talk more about our natural rights and sort of about the natural law foundations of our government, which is how they were thinking about these things and why we didn't need a Bill of Rights? Or would we see a Constitution as a Bill of Rights, as Hamilton and Madison and James Wilson did? All very interesting. I can't say because it's counterfactual, but it is interesting to think if it didn't happen, because it's very possible that it might not have.
Well, definitely something to think about a little more. I think it's time for some audience questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jewel and Jorn. Those are great questions as usual. And before we go to the audience questions, I did want to mention Tony is a senior fellow with the Bill of Rights Institute, and y'all had a great Constitution Day program. And I want to make sure that we get that in our Q&A link. So I'm going to ask Aubrey and Elizabeth to work on putting that out. And Tony, is there anything you want to say about the Bill of Rights, your Bill of Rights Institute Constitution Day program?
Yeah, it was great. We've done several of these, are all available on our YouTube channel, on our website. This year, we were talking about the Constitution and Lincoln and the founders and presidential power and so forth. We had CBS's correspondent Major Garrett on with scholar Laura Brown. We had some other scholars, my good friend John Schaff and Dan Mahoney, talking about Lincoln and prudence and moderation and constitutionalism. My colleague Mary also interviewed a national park ranger over at the Lincoln Memorial. So a lot of fun things. And then my colleagues were talking about the Constitution and its application to teaching for all the teachers out there. So it's a 3 or 4 hour program. You can look at particular segments, chock full of great stuff, just like Constituting America.
Well, that's great. Lots of opportunities for students and classes to learn. Now, I want to mention a comment by Martha Jenkins. Martha said, Tova just made a very wise comment. Very few adults admit they're wrong when faced with facts or changing scenarios. And that is so true and so admirable that James Madison changed his position, because I'm sure that was not easy for him. In going to some of our other audience questions, let's see. Eric Braverman asked a really interesting question. He said, did Madison choose June 8th to introduce the Bill of Rights because Washington sent his circular on rights, and was it circular on rights and justice, or circular, he says, on June 8th, 1783, and Arthur Lee's motion for independence approved then? Do you think that's how Madison chose June 8th?
It's an interesting, I don't think I have ever seen any evidence of that, but I am willing to stand corrected myself on that. But but you're right. Washington has this great sort of farewell. It's called the Circular to the States. It's right in William Allen's brief collection. You can get it for $10 on Washington's papers. And Washington's retiring from the army, and he sort of sends, it's almost like an early version of his farewell address, right? And advice to his countrymen. And of course, we have a lot of important dates in June and July in 1776 for independence. So perhaps a really amazing coincidence, just like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both passing on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I don't think there's an exact connection, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Well, thank you. And then Sandy Thatcher asks, have you read Ted Cruz's Princeton Senior Thesis, 1992, on the 9th and 10th Amendments? Sandy says it's very well done, and Senator Cruz should be invited to talk about those amendments in one of our upcoming podcasts.
Mm-hmm. I have not read that, I have to admit, but real briefly, yeah. I mean, the 9th Amendment was put in there, right, to address those concerns that if you leave certain rights out, they're not going to be protected. So the 9th Amendment basically says the inclusion of these rights in the Bill of Rights does not disparage other rights, or does not mean that those other rights are not protected. Who defines them is sort of an open-ended question, right? Is it the courts? Is it is it the other branches? Is it the people themselves? It's a big question. The 10th Amendment also, reserves powers to the states. Very important example of federalism. The principle of federalism really central. It's right in the amendment process itself. It was in the Senate before the 17th Amendment and so forth. So principle of federalism, obviously very important. So yeah, 9th and 10th are very, very important. 1 through 8 protect specific liberties, limit government. 9th and 10th sort of address important constitutional principles of the framework of government.
Well, thank you. And, we want to remind our listeners that this Thursday evening, speaking of Professor Gordon Lloyd, who you brought up, Professor Lloyd is going to be on our book club at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be doing part 2 of the book that Professor Lloyd edited, which is James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention. And it is really fascinating to read James Madison's actual notes from the Constitutional Convention. And our listeners got through parts 1 and 2 this summer. I think Gordon Lloyd divides it into Acts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we did Acts 1 and 2 this summer, and we're doing Acts 3 and 4 Thursday night, day after tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern. So we want to encourage everyone to join us. Then I wanted to put a pitch in for one other thing. Aubrey, if you want to pull up this poster, that is one of our best-selling posters in the Constituting America store. You can go on our website and click store, and it's really interesting. It's called 25 Things the Government Cannot Make You Do. And it is based on the Bill of Rights. And this actually came from an essay, one of our 90-day study essays that Horace Cooper did, called The Bill of Rights, Bulwark of American Liberty. And Horace listed out 25 things that the government cannot make you do based on the Bill of Rights. And we had one of our 90-day study participants and donors contacted us and said, y'all should make this into a poster. So we did. And we've probably sold at least between 500 and 1,000 of these posters over the past few years. They're very popular. So you all might want to think about ordering one of these as we study the Bill of Rights, and you can follow the poster along on all the different, what these different amendments actually do. So, and I think we are right at time. But Tony, we want to thank you again so much for being with us. This was a fascinating episode, and just wanted to see if you have any closing comments.
No, just a thanks to you and to our whole panel here, as well as all the viewers. This is a great topic, a great story, and I think we would all be better off studying and emulating James Madison as much as possible.
Definitely. And Jewel and Jorn, anything y'all want to say before we close out?
Thanks for another great show.
Yeah, can't wait to do it again.
Well, thank you, Tony. And thank you to the audience. We hope to see you Thursday night with Professor Lloyd, 7 p.m. Eastern. And next week, we're going to be talking about the First Amendment. So join us back next Tuesday at 2 as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.